There are places in America where voices never learned how to speak. Where pain existed long before language arrived. Where suffering passed not through history books, but through blood. This is one of those places. For nearly 70 years, a secret lay buried in the deep folds of the Appalachian foothills of Alabama, a secret so corrosive that even those who uncovered it struggled to give it a name. It was not a myth, not a legend, and not an exaggeration. It was the consequence of isolation taken to its extreme, of poverty hardened into doctrine, and of fear reshaped into tradition. In the early 1950s, deep within the forests of Claiborne County, there existed a settlement untouched by modern life. The land sat more than 40 kilometers from the nearest town, accessible only by a dirt road that dissolved into mud during winter rains and vanished entirely beneath summer overgrowth. No streetlights. No telephones. No electricity. The outside world might as well have been another planet. This was Harmon land. 15 hectares of forested isolation, claimed and controlled by a single bloodline for generations. The Harmon family did not merely live apart from society, they rejected it. And at the center of this self-imposed exile stood Joseph Harmon, the family patriarch, whose authority stretched far beyond land ownership and into the very structure of human relationships. Joseph Harmon believed in one unbreakable rule. Harmon blood must remain Harmon. It was not a suggestion. It was law. Across 3 generations, this belief hardened into practice. Cousins were paired as spouses. Uncles fathered children with nieces. Brothers shared bloodlines with sisters. These unions were not whispered scandals, they were expected. Enforced. Repeated. Over time, the family tree did not branch outward. It folded inward. Doctors would later describe it as a genetic knot, a tightening spiral that trapped every child born within it. But in 1953, none of that was public knowledge. That October, on a cold, rain-soaked night, a young woman appeared at the doors of the Claiborne County Hospital after walking nearly 27 kilometers on foot. She was barefoot. Malnourished. Barely clothed for the weather. In her arms, she carried a newborn infant wrapped in stained fabric. Her name was Martha Harmon. She was 19 years old. Hospital staff immediately noticed that Martha did not speak the way other adults did. Her words came slowly, clumsily, as if pulled from a limited supply. She struggled to answer basic questions, not because she refused, but because she had never learned how. Her vocabulary, later assessed, consisted of fewer than 200 words. Martha had never attended school. She had never seen a city. She had never held a book. She understood almost nothing of the world beyond her family's land. The child she carried told its own story. Dr. William Carson, the physician on duty that night, would later write in his medical journal that the infant displayed severe cranial malformations, fused and misshapen fingers, and facial irregularities consistent with congenital disorders rarely seen together. To Carson, the signs were unmistakable. This child had been born into a closed bloodline. When asked who the father was, Martha lowered her eyes. She did not answer. At the time, no one pressed her further. What the hospital staff did not yet understand was that Martha Harmon was not just a frightened young mother seeking help. She was the first woman in her family's history to escape. Her journey to the hospital was not guided by medical knowledge or legal awareness. It was driven by something far more primitive, an instinct to protect. She could not name what was wrong with her daughter. She only knew that staying meant death. Later investigations would reveal that Martha herself was the product of incest, the daughter of Joseph Harmon and his first cousin, Emily Harmon. The infant in her arms was conceived through a union with her half-brother, Robert Harmon, 12 years her senior. Within the family, this was not considered abuse. It was tradition. Records would eventually show that since the 1930s, at least 37 children had been born on Harmon property. Fewer than 20 survived beyond adolescence. Many were never officially registered. Some never received names. Those who lived often bore visible scars, cognitive impairments, skeletal deformities, developmental delays that worsened with each generation. When social worker Eleanora Wright was assigned to Martha's case in November of 1953, she described the situation in her report as conditions incompatible with any modern definition of human dignity. Women within the Harmon family, Wright wrote, were treated as possessions rather than people. Education was forbidden. Contact with outsiders was framed as contamination. Every aspect of life, marriage, childbirth, movement, was controlled by Joseph Harmon. As Wright dug deeper, the scope of the situation expanded beyond anything the county had encountered before. Martha's arrival at the hospital triggered a chain reaction. At first, authorities hesitated. Rural Alabama had long maintained an unspoken rule: family matters stayed within families. But Dr. Carson refused to let the case fade quietly into the shadows. He compiled medical evidence documenting the physical damage caused by generations of close-kin reproduction and presented it to state officials. By December 1953, the state could no longer look away. A small team was assembled: social workers, medical professionals, and legal representatives, and ordered to conduct the first official inspection of Harmon property. What they found there would shock even the most experienced among them. 7 crude cabins stood scattered across the land, none equipped with electricity or running water. Waste was disposed of in open pits. Food stores were minimal. Signs of chronic hunger were visible everywhere. When the team arrived, Joseph Harmon greeted them with a shotgun resting across his arms. He was 67 years old. Behind him stood his 2 eldest children, both displaying obvious cognitive impairment. According to official notes, Joseph's first words were not a greeting, but a declaration. "We do not recognize your authority here." Negotiations lasted for hours. Only after prolonged discussion did Joseph agree to allow a brief inspection, under the condition that no one would be removed from the land. What the team documented over the next several hours would become the foundation of one of the most significant state interventions in Alabama's rural history. 27 people lived on the property, all related by blood. The women, in particular, displayed profound social withdrawal. Many avoided eye contact. Some flinched at raised voices. Several could not form complete sentences. Among the children, the evidence was impossible to ignore. 5 under the age of 10 exhibited severe physical abnormalities: extra fingers, underdeveloped jaws, misshapen skulls. Others showed signs of delayed development so advanced that doctors struggled to estimate their ages accurately. Dr. Carson's preliminary medical report was blunt. The effects of prolonged consanguinity were present across multiple generations. These conditions were compounded by malnutrition, lack of prenatal care, and total absence of education. But the most disturbing discovery came days later. Hidden inside one of the cabins was a diary. It belonged to Sarah Harmon, Martha's aunt, one of the few women in the family who had received limited schooling before the family's total withdrawal from society. Sarah had died in 1949, but her words remained. Page after page documented births, deaths, and what she called harm diseases. One entry, dated 1941, chilled investigators. "I buried my 4th unnamed child today," she wrote. "He was born like the others, too small, unable to breathe right. Joseph says God is testing us. But I believe something is wrong with our blood. When I say this, he becomes furious. He says Harmon blood is the purest in America." Sarah's diary would become the first documented proof that someone inside the family had recognized the pattern, even if she lacked the scientific language to explain it. And it would ensure that the silence surrounding Harmon land could never return. Sarah Harmon's diary changed everything. Until its discovery, the case against the Harmon family rested largely on medical observation and witness testimony. The diary transformed suspicion into chronology. It established intent, awareness, and repetition. Most importantly, it proved that at least one woman inside the family had recognized that what was happening was not divine will, but damage passed through blood. In January of 1954, armed with this new evidence, state authorities returned to Harmon property with a court-issued mandate to medically examine all minors living on the land. Joseph Harmon refused. What followed was the first recorded instance of physical resistance in the case. According to official records, Joseph attempted to block access to the cabins, shouting that the state had no right to count Harmon children like livestock. The standoff ended only after deputies restrained him and placed him under temporary arrest. For the first time in generations, doctors were able to examine the younger members of the Harmon family without interference. The results were devastating. Children as young as 4 showed signs of neurological delay. Several displayed skeletal abnormalities severe enough to limit mobility. 3 required constant supervision due to profound impairments. The pattern was unmistakable. Each successive generation exhibited more severe manifestations than the one before. The state requested assistance from the University of Alabama. Geneticist Dr. Howard Jensen was invited to study the case. His preliminary findings, published in March 1954, would later be cited for decades as one of the clearest documented examples of what he termed endogamic amplification, the compounding effect of repeated close-kin reproduction within an isolated population. The Harmon lineage, Jensen wrote, demonstrates an incidence of congenital anomalies approximately 4 times higher than that of the general population, with severity increasing across generations. The language was clinical. The reality was anything but. While scientists documented the damage, Martha Harmon and her infant daughter remained under hospital care. Slowly, under consistent nutrition and exposure to speech, Martha's world began to expand. She learned new words, new concepts, new boundaries of possibility. In sessions with psychologists, she described life on Harmon land in fragments, long silences punctuated by sudden clarity. There was a hierarchy, she explained. Men commanded. Women obeyed. Education was forbidden. Curiosity was punished. Any challenge to tradition was met with isolation, sometimes confinement in a darkened cabin for days at a time. Spring of 1954 marked a turning point. The Harmon case spilled into public view, igniting fierce debate across Alabama. Editorials questioned how such conditions could exist unchecked within state borders. Religious leaders argued over the limits of government interference. Lawmakers faced a question with no comfortable answer: when does tradition become abuse? Then 3 more women came forward. Jessie Harmon, age 32. Rebecca Harmon, 27. Laura Harmon, just 23. Each had fled the property quietly, following the path Martha had unknowingly carved. Their testimonies were gathered over months of interviews with trauma specialists. Piece by piece, a fuller picture emerged. Jessie had given birth to 7 children. Only 2 survived past infancy. She spoke softly, often pausing as if unsure whether memory itself was allowed. Reading, she said, was forbidden because Joseph believed it spoiled women's wombs. Any girl caught practicing letters was punished. Eventually, they stopped trying. Rebecca described the systems used to maintain isolation. Bells were hidden along the access road. When they rang, everyone scattered. Children were trained to hide in caves or woods. Outsiders were described as thieves, sinners, corrupters of blood. Laura's testimony carried a different weight. She had preserved fragments of her mother's diary, Sarah's writings, hidden for years beneath loose floorboards. Those pages revealed that doubts about Harmon practices had surfaced as early as 1937, after Sarah lost 4 infants to severe malformations. One passage, dated 1942, stood out. "I asked Joseph to let me seek help," Sarah wrote. "He said our suffering began when strangers touched me during my delivery years ago. He said they poisoned our blood. He says we must isolate further." Dr. Jensen's team began preliminary genetic testing using the limited methods available in the 1950s: blood group analysis, phenotypic comparison, inheritance mapping. Despite technological constraints, the patterns were undeniable. Rare recessive conditions appeared with alarming frequency. Disorders that typically surfaced once in thousands of births appeared repeatedly within a single family. Of the 19 children under 18 identified on Harmon land, 14 exhibited physical or cognitive impairments. 3 required full-time care. 2 would later die from complications related to congenital heart defects. The legal system now stood at a crossroads. Judge Harold Blackwood, assigned to the case, described the dilemma in his notes: "We are confronted with a collision between parental autonomy and undeniable medical harm. Non-interference can no longer be justified." In June of 1954, after months of testimony and evaluation, the Claiborne County Court issued a ruling that would reshape state precedent. Joseph Harmon and his two eldest children were declared legally responsible for systematic neglect and the creation of conditions harmful to minors. Children were placed under temporary state protection. Adult women were given a choice: remain on the land under supervision or seek assistance reintegrating into society. The backlash was immediate. Religious groups protested what they called governmental overreach. Editorials accused the state of criminalizing poverty. But behind the noise, lives were already changing. Martha moved into a rehabilitation center with her daughter. In 7 months, her vocabulary quadrupled. Her ability to learn astonished specialists. The assumptions once made about her limitations quietly dissolved. Her daughter, named Hope by hospital staff, underwent treatment for her congenital conditions. Despite physical challenges, fused fingers, jaw abnormalities, her cognitive development progressed within normal ranges. By fall of 1954, the Harmon case had become a catalyst. Alabama's Department of Public Health launched targeted programs to monitor isolated communities, particularly in mountainous regions. Harmon land fell under ongoing supervision. Joseph Harmon returned to the property after serving 6 months in detention, but under strict conditions. He could no longer block access to education or medical care. The women who escaped became subjects of a long-term study conducted by the University of Alabama, initially planned for 5 years, ultimately spanning 2 decades. Psychologist Dr. Elizabeth Townsend documented what she described as accelerated cognitive recovery. When finally exposed to stimulation, she wrote, "Individuals deprived of education for decades demonstrate remarkable capacity for adaptation." Martha was the clearest example. By 1956, she could read and write at a basic level. She learned vocational skills. She found work assisting at a local daycare, caring for children in ways she herself had never been cared for. And the silence that once defined Harmon land continued to break. As the years passed, the Harmon case refused to settle into obscurity. What had begun as a single woman's desperate walk through the rain evolved into one of the most closely studied examples of extreme familial isolation in American history. By the mid-1950s, researchers, lawmakers, and social workers all understood that what had occurred on Harmon land was not an anomaly born of madness, but the logical endpoint of fear allowed to harden into law. The fragments of Sarah Harmon's diary became central to this understanding. Recovered slowly through Laura's careful preservation, the pages were examined by historians and anthropologists seeking to reconstruct how a once ordinary family could collapse inward so completely. Census records and municipal archives revealed a past Joseph Harmon himself never spoke of. Before the isolation, the Harmon family had not been poor. Nor had they been unknown. Historian Dr. Robert Fleming uncovered records showing that Joseph Harmon Sr. had once been a respected merchant, well integrated into the local economy throughout the early 20th century. The family attended church. Their children went to school. They traded openly with neighboring towns. The rupture came in the late 1920s. Financial records pointed to mounting debt, followed by accusations of fraud in 1928. When the Great Depression struck, the Harmons lost nearly everything. Court documents suggested that relocation to the remote property coincided not only with economic collapse, but with social disgrace. What began as flight, Fleming wrote, gradually transformed into ideology. Isolation first served as protection from creditors, from judgment, from shame. Over time, it evolved into belief. Pseudo-religious language replaced accountability. Blood purity became justification. Distrust of outsiders hardened into doctrine. Within 2 generations, escape became unthinkable. In 1957, the case reached national attention when Dr. Jensen's study was published in the Journal of Medical Genetics. The paper, titled Phenotypic Consequences of Prolonged Consanguinity, the Harmon Case, documented genetic patterns across 3 generations with unprecedented detail. The findings were stark. Rare recessive disorders appeared at a rate 27 times higher than the general population. Conditions that normally manifested sporadically became predictable. Even more troubling was the progressive intensification of symptoms, deformities that worsened, cognitive impairments that deepened, survivability that declined. Jensen coined the term endogamic amplification to describe the phenomenon. In genetically diverse populations, the study explained, deleterious recessive genes typically remain latent. In closed systems such as the Harmon lineage, probability compounds with each generation. The publication ignited ethical debate across medical and legal communities. Questions surfaced that had no easy resolution. Where should the boundary lie between cultural autonomy and biological harm? How far can tradition be permitted to go when children bear the cost? And what social conditions allow such practices to persist unnoticed? While scholars argued, the Harmon women continued their work of survival. Jessie, the eldest of the four who escaped, made a decision few expected. In 1958, she returned to Harmon land, not as a subordinate, but as an intermediary. She negotiated access for social workers. She ensured that remaining children received basic education and medical attention. Rebecca and Laura chose a different path. They remained in the city, participating fully in rehabilitation programs. By 1960, both held formal employment and lived independently, milestones that once seemed unimaginable given their upbringing. Their progress challenged prevailing assumptions. The belief that decades of isolation permanently crippled human potential began to erode. With support, adaptation proved not only possible, but rapid. In 1963, a decade after the first intervention, Dr. Jensen's team released a follow-up study examining long-term outcomes among Harmon children. Of the 14 minors identified with congenital conditions in 1954, 9 showed measurable improvement following treatment and environmental enrichment. 3 remained severely impaired and required lifelong care. 2 had died from complications linked to congenital heart defects. The property itself changed. Joseph Harmon died in 1966 at the age of 80. With his death, much of the ideological resistance collapsed. His surviving children, initially wary of the outside world, gradually permitted greater integration. Martha Harmon emerged as an unexpected figure of influence. In 1967, she began speaking to social work professionals, not as a subject of study, but as a voice of lived experience. Her perspective bridged 2 worlds, one defined by silence, the other by choice. In a 1972 address to students, she reflected with unsettling clarity. "People ask if I'm angry," she said. "It's not that simple. My father believed he was protecting us. Fear came first. Ignorance followed. Then pride made it permanent." Her words reshaped how authorities approached similar cases. Condemnation gave way to collaboration. Education and healthcare became entry points rather than weapons. Hope, the child whose birth exposed everything, grew beyond early predictions. Though she required multiple surgeries to correct skeletal and facial abnormalities, her cognitive development remained typical. In 1972, she graduated high school, an achievement no one could have imagined on the night she was carried through hospital doors. In 1975, the Harmon case resurfaced during congressional hearings on rural health and isolated populations. Martha and Jessie testified before lawmakers, offering complementary truths. Jessie's statement cut through policy language. "There are children alive right now who don't know there is a world beyond the mountains," she said. "They don't know they don't have to marry their own blood. They don't know harm can be prevented." The hearings led to nationwide recommendations, culturally sensitive education initiatives, mobile medical units, genetic counseling programs designed for geographically isolated regions. Academically, the case left a lasting imprint. Data gathered from Harmon descendants continued to inform genetic research well into the 1980s. When consanguineous union ceased, the next generation experienced a dramatic decline in congenital disorders, a living demonstration of genetic diversity's protective effect. Judicial rulings from the case were later cited in over 40 child welfare decisions involving cultural or religious isolation. Martha Harmon died in 1998 at 64 years old. Her obituary did not describe her as a victim. She transformed suffering into illumination, the editor wrote. She gave voice to those history left silent. Hope, who later took the surname Collins, followed her mother's path. She earned a degree in social work, specializing in outreach to isolated rural communities. In 2001, she received a State Public Service Award for her work bringing education and genetic health awareness to places still hidden by distance. The legacy of the Harmon women is not found in court rulings or medical journals. It lives in the children who were never born into silence. In the generation spared. In the understanding that courage, even when uneducated, unnamed, and afraid, can fracture cycles thought unbreakable. And in the quiet truth that sometimes, history does not change through revolutions, but through one woman walking out of the dark, carrying a child, refusing to turn back.